The first time Sarah McKenna drove a star drill into the red sandstone of the canyon wall, her neighbor, James Hutchins, rode up on his bay mare and laughed so hard he nearly fell from the saddle. "Woman, what in God's name are you doing?" he called out, still chuckling as he dismounted. "You planning to dig yourself a grave in that rock?" Sarah set down her sledgehammer and wiped the red dust from her face. Her 7-year-old son Jacob stood nearby, holding a bucket of iron spikes and watching his mother with the quiet confidence children have when they believe their parents can do anything. "I'm building a barn, Mr. Hutchins," Sarah said simply. "Into the canyon wall." James stared at her for a long moment, waiting for the joke. When none came, his amusement turned to concern. "Sarah, you can't be serious. A barn needs to be built proper, with timber framing and a foundation. You can't just carve one out of a cliff." "Why not?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about his reasoning. "The ancestral Puebloans did it for centuries, built entire cities into these canyon walls. If it worked for them, it'll work for me." "That was different. They were—" James paused, searching for words. "Those were houses, not barns, and that was a long time ago. We build proper structures now, with lumber and nails and right angles." "Lumber that costs money I don't have," Sarah said quietly. "And proper structures that burn in wildfires or blow down in windstorms. The canyon wall doesn't burn, Mr. Hutchins, and it won't blow down." James shook his head, mounting his horse again. "You're wasting your time, Sarah, and making yourself look foolish. When winter comes and you've got no barn for your animals, don't say I didn't warn you." He rode off, but Sarah could hear him laughing all the way down the canyon. That was in August of 1887, in what would eventually become southeastern Utah, but was then still wild frontier territory. Sarah had come west 2 years earlier with her husband Thomas and young Jacob, seeking land and opportunity. They'd filed a homestead claim on 160 acres in a remote canyon where a small spring provided year-round water, rare and precious in this arid country. The land was beautiful but harsh. Red sandstone cliffs rose on 3 sides, with the canyon opening to the south. The spring emerged from the rock face on the eastern wall, creating a small creek that supported cottonwood trees and good grass for livestock. It was isolated. The nearest neighbors were 3 miles away, but Thomas had seen the potential. Then, 6 months ago, Thomas had been thrown from his horse while chasing a stray cow. He'd struck his head on a rock and died 3 days later without regaining consciousness. Sarah had found herself alone in the wilderness with a 7-year-old son, 4 milk cows, a dozen chickens, 2 pigs, 1 aging mule, and no barn. Thomas had planned to build a barn that spring. He'd even started cutting timber from the pine forest 12 miles north, hauling it down in the wagon. But he'd only managed to bring 3 loads before the accident, and Sarah knew it wasn't nearly enough for a proper barn. Buying more lumber would cost money she didn't have, and she lacked the skill and strength to cut and haul timber herself. She'd spent weeks trying to figure out what to do. The animals needed shelter for the coming winter. The makeshift lean-to she'd constructed from scrap wood and canvas wouldn't protect them from the bitter cold and heavy snows that could hit this high country. Then, one evening, she'd been reading to Jacob from a book about the ancient cliff dwellings scattered throughout the region. Jacob had pointed to an illustration of a pueblo built into an alcove high in a canyon wall. "Why did they build in the rock, Mama?" he'd asked. "To protect themselves from the weather and from enemies," Sarah had explained. "The rock sheltered them. It stayed cool in summer and warm in winter." Jacob had thought about this for a moment. "Could we build our barn in the rock, like they did?" The idea had struck Sarah with the force of revelation. Why not? The canyon wall directly behind their cabin had a natural alcove about 15 feet deep, 40 feet wide, and 20 feet high, large enough for a good-sized barn. The overhang would provide a natural roof. She would only need to build a front wall to enclose it, and maybe some interior dividers for stalls. It would require different skills than conventional construction, but Sarah was nothing if not resourceful. She'd spent the next week examining the alcove, planning, measuring, sketching designs on scraps of paper. The more she thought about it, the more sense it made. But when she'd mentioned the idea to her neighbors at the church social, the response had been immediate and unanimous. She was crazy. "Sarah, you can't carve a barn out of solid rock," Margaret Hutchins had said, her voice kind but firm. "It's not possible. Not for a lone woman, not for anyone without proper mining equipment." "The Indians did it," Sarah had protested. "The Indians used caves that were already there," Robert Kemp had countered. "They didn't dig them out themselves. And even if you could hollow out that alcove, how would you frame it? How would you hang doors? How would you keep the cold from coming in?" "I'll figure it out," Sarah had said, but the neighbors had just shaken their heads and exchanged concerned looks. By the end of the evening, she'd overheard them whispering about, "Poor Sarah," and "the grief has affected her mind," and "someone should talk to her about selling the claim before she gets herself and that boy killed." Sarah had left the social early, taking Jacob home in their wagon, her jaw set with determination. She'd started work the next morning. The alcove itself didn't need much excavation. Centuries of wind and water had done most of the work. But the floor was uneven, cluttered with fallen rock and debris, and the back wall needed to be smoothed in places. Sarah began by clearing the space, hauling out rocks and debris in a wheelbarrow she'd inherited from Thomas. Jacob helped, carrying smaller rocks in a bucket, his young arms straining but his spirit willing. They worked together every day from dawn until the heat became too intense, then resumed in the late afternoon until dark. The neighbors continued to mock her. James Hutchins made a habit of riding by once a week to check on her progress and offer condescending advice. Other homesteaders would stop their wagons on the road to stare and point, sometimes calling out jokes. "How's that rock barn coming, Mrs. McKenna? Found any gold while you're digging, Sarah?"
"My husband says you're planning to live like a cliff dweller. That true?"
But Sarah kept working. She'd learned from bitter experience that people's opinions changed only when confronted with results, not arguments. The real challenge was creating anchor points in the sandstone for the timber framing. She needed to secure heavy beams across the alcove opening to support the front wall and door. This required drilling deep holes into the rock, hard, slow work with the tools available in 1887. Sarah used a star drill, a tool that had been used for centuries to bore holes in stone. It was a steel rod, about 18 inches long, with a star-shaped cutting tip. The process was brutally simple. Position the drill against the rock, strike it with a sledgehammer, rotate it a quarter turn, strike again, rotate, strike. Over and over, hour after hour, until the hole was deep enough. Each hole took days to drill. Sarah's hands blistered, then calloused. Her shoulders ached constantly. But she persisted, drilling holes at strategic points where she would anchor the main support beams. Jacob helped by clearing away the rock dust with a brush, keeping the drill hole clean so Sarah could see her progress. He also learned to hold the drill steady while she hammered, though Sarah only allowed this for the shallower holes, where a slipped hammer blow wouldn't cause serious injury. "Tell me again why we're doing this, Mama," Jacob would say during their water breaks, sitting in the shade of the cottonwoods. "Because we need a barn to protect our animals through winter," Sarah would explain. And because when you don't have money or help, you have to use what you have, which is this canyon wall and our own 2 hands. And because the neighbors say we can't, Jacob added with a small smile. Sarah ruffled his hair. That too, maybe. By September, she had drilled 8 deep anchor holes and was ready to install the main support beams. This required creativity and leverage, since she couldn't lift the heavy timbers alone. She rigged a pulley system using rope and a block and tackle, anchoring it to a sturdy cottonwood tree. With Jacob helping to pull on the rope, she managed to raise each beam into position, one end at a time, walking it up the rock face inch by inch. The beams were the precious timber Thomas had cut. Massive ponderosa pine logs, roughly squared with a broadaxe, each one representing days of his labor. Sarah felt his presence as she worked with them, could almost hear his voice guiding her. That's it. Steady now. Make sure it's level before you secure it. She'd carved wooden wedges that fit into the drilled holes, then drove the beam ends into position, the wedges swelling with moisture to hold everything tight. It was the same technique ancient shipwrights had used, and frontier builders still employed when metal fasteners were too expensive or unavailable. Each wedge had to be precisely shaped. Too loose and the beam would pull free, too tight and the wood might split the rock. Sarah used her husband's draw knife to shape each one, testing the fit repeatedly until it was perfect. The work was meticulous and time-consuming, but there was no room for error. These beams would bear the entire weight of the front wall and door, and they had to hold for years, through countless cycles of heat and cold, expansion and contraction. The beams created a framework across the alcove opening. Next came the front wall, which Sarah built using a combination of the remaining timber for framing and red sandstone blocks she quarried from a softer section of the canyon wall downstream. She'd learned masonry basics from watching Thomas repair their cabin's stone foundation. Working stone was different from working wood. You had to read the grain of the rock, understand where it wanted to split, use its natural planes to your advantage. Sarah used a simple steel wedge and a hammer to split sandstone blocks, then shaped them with a mason's hammer. The front wall rose slowly through October. Sarah laid courses of stone, mixing mortar from sand, lime, and water. The lime came from burning limestone rocks she found in a dry wash, another ancient technique still used on the frontier. She built a small kiln from rocks, stacked limestone inside, built a hot fire, and maintained it for 2 days until the limestone transformed into quicklime. Mixed with water and sand, it created a serviceable mortar. Jacob helped mix mortar, carefully measuring the proportions as his mother had taught him. 3 parts sand to 1 part lime, with enough water to make it workable, but not soupy. His small hands weren't strong enough for heavy lifting, but he could keep the mortar consistent and bring his mother the right-sized stones when she called for them. The wall didn't need to be solid. Sarah left spaces for windows to let in light and air. She framed these openings with timber and later covered them with oiled canvas that could be rolled down in bad weather. For the door, she used the widest planks from Thomas's timber pile, joining them with Z-braces made from smaller boards. The hinges were a problem. Metal hinges cost money. Instead, Sarah carved wooden pintles and gudgeons, traditional wooden hinges that worked perfectly well if made properly. The door hung on 3 sets of these wooden hinges, each one carefully shaped and positioned. Inside the alcove, Sarah used more of the quarried sandstone to build dividers, creating stalls for the cows, a pen for the pigs, a roosting area for the chickens. She built a hayloft using a platform of small logs covered with planks, accessible by a ladder. The natural rock ceiling was high enough that she could store a winter's worth of hay without crowding the animals below. The rock floor, once leveled and covered with packed earth and straw, made an excellent base, cool, dry, and easy to clean. Sarah dug a shallow drainage channel along one side, sloping slightly so that water and waste could be swept out easily. By early November, the barn was essentially complete. Sarah had spent 3 months of hard labor, working dawn to dusk, and the result was unlike any barn her neighbors had ever seen. From the outside, it appeared to be a simple stone wall built into the canyon face, with a wooden door and several canvas-covered windows. But inside, it was spacious, well-ventilated, and surprisingly warm. The thermal mass of the surrounding rock helped moderate temperature swings. The neighbors remained skeptical. Margaret Hutchins visited in mid-November and walked through the barn with obvious surprise. "Well, I'll admit it's sturdy," she said carefully. "And the animals seem comfortable enough. But Sarah, what happens when winter really sets in? That rock will be ice cold. The animals will freeze." "The rock will be warmer than you think," Sarah said confidently. "In summer, it stays cool when the air outside is hot. In winter, it holds heat better than wood walls do. The earth is a natural insulator." Margaret looked doubtful, but said nothing more. The real test came in late December. A winter storm rolled in from the north, bringing bitter cold and heavy snow. The temperature dropped well below zero. Sarah's thermometer, hanging on the north wall of the cabin, registered 15 degrees below on the second morning. Snow fell for 3 days straight, driven by winds that howled through the canyon like the voices of angry spirits. Drifts built up against the cabin walls, rising nearly to the windowsills. The world became nothing but white and cold and the constant moan of wind. It was the kind of storm that could devastate unprepared homesteaders, the kind that frontier families whispered about in the dark, knowing that every winter brought the possibility of such a test. Sarah had heard the stories. Entire families found frozen in their cabins when spring came, their livestock dead, their supplies exhausted. She was determined that wouldn't be their fate. Sarah and Jacob stayed warm in their cabin, the stone fireplace keeping the interior comfortable. Sarah had laid in a good supply of firewood, stacked against the cabin wall where it stayed dry under the roof's overhang. She kept the fire burning constantly, feeding it throughout the night, watching the flames dance and listening to the storm's fury outside. But Sarah worried about the animals. She'd moved them all into the rock barn before the storm hit, carrying extra hay and filling the water troughs. Now she needed to know if her design would protect them, if all those months of back-breaking work had truly created the shelter she'd envisioned. The doubt crept in during the long night hours, whispering questions. What if the neighbors were right? What if the rock walls conducted cold instead of insulating against it? What if her calculations were wrong and the animals were freezing in that stone chamber? On the second morning of the storm, she bundled up and waded through thigh-deep snow to the barn. The door, sheltered by the natural overhang, had only a light dusting of snow against it. She pulled it open and stepped inside. The difference in temperature was immediate and dramatic. While it wasn't exactly warm inside, it was noticeably warmer than the brutal cold outside. The animals were calm, the cows chewing their hay contentedly, the chickens roosting quietly. The thick rock walls and the insulating snow outside had created a buffer against the extreme cold. Sarah felt vindication wash over her, but she kept it to herself. The real test would come when the neighbors saw for themselves. The storm broke on the fourth day, revealing a transformed landscape buried under 3 feet of snow. Sarah was shoveling a path from her cabin to the barn when she heard a wagon struggling up the snow-covered road. James Hutchins, driving his team hard, his face grim. "Sarah!" he called out, putting the wagon to a stop. "We need help! Our barn collapsed under the snow. The roof gave way last night. We got the horses out, but the cows are trapped under timber and we can't—" He stopped, suddenly noticing that Sarah's barn was not only standing, but appeared completely undamaged. "How is your barn still—" he began, then shook his head. "Never mind that now. Can you help us?" "Of course," Sarah said immediately. "Jacob, get my tools. Mr. Hutchins, lead the way." Over the next few hours, Sarah helped the Hutchins family dig through the collapsed barn and extract their terrified cattle. 2 cows had been injured but survived. The barn itself was a total loss. The heavy snow load had exceeded what the timber frame could bear, and the entire structure had pancaked. As they worked, other neighbors arrived with similar stories. Robert Kemp's barn had partially collapsed. The Morrison family's lean-to had been completely destroyed, and they'd lost most of their livestock. The Williams family had managed to move their animals into their cabin, but the crowding was becoming unbearable. By evening, a group of desperate homesteaders stood in Sarah's canyon, looking at her rock barn with new eyes. "Sarah," James Hutchins said quietly, his pride clearly wounded, but his practicality winning out. "I need to ask a favor. Can we bring our cattle here? At least until we can rebuild our barn in the spring?" Sarah looked at the faces of her neighbors, the same people who'd mocked her, called her crazy, predicted her failure. She saw desperation, humility, and genuine need. "Yes," she said simply. "Bring them all. There's room." Over the next 2 days, the canyon became a refuge. The Hutchins family brought their 4 cows and 2 horses. The Kemps brought 3 cows. The Morrisons brought their remaining 2 horses and a milk cow. Even the Williams family, who lived 4 miles away, brought their animals after hearing about the rock barn that had survived the storm. Sarah's barn, which she'd designed for her modest livestock, now housed animals from 6 families. It was crowded but manageable, and more importantly, the animals were safe and relatively warm. The neighbors worked together to care for the livestock, taking turns feeding and cleaning. And as they worked, they examined Sarah's construction with growing respect and wonder. "These anchor points," James said, running his hand over one of the beam attachments. "You drilled these into solid rock." "Star drill and sledgehammer," Sarah confirmed. "Same way they drill blast holes in mines, just on a smaller scale." "And this masonry work, did you learn this from your husband?" "Some of it. The rest I figured out as I went." Robert Kemp studied the interior layout. "The way you positioned these stalls, using the natural curves of the rock, it's efficient. More space than I would have thought possible." Margaret Hutchins, feeding the chickens in their roosting area, called out, "Sarah, it's actually warm in here. Not cold at all. How is that possible?" Sarah explained about thermal mass, about how the rock absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night, about how the earth itself provided insulation that timber walls could never match. The neighbors listened with the attention of students before a teacher, their earlier mockery forgotten. The winter continued its assault. 2 more major storms hit in January, each one bringing heavy snow and bitter cold. Each time, the conventional barns that had survived the first storm took more damage, while Sarah's rock barns stood unchanged, unmoved, untroubled by the fury outside. By February, word had spread throughout the territory. Homesteaders from miles around came to see the barn built into the canyon wall. Some were curious, some skeptical, but all left impressed. A few even began planning their own rock barns, asking Sarah for advice. One afternoon, a man arrived in a fine buggy, wearing city clothes and carrying a leather portfolio. He introduced himself as Henry Morrison from the Territorial Surveyor's Office, a government man responsible for documenting innovative homesteading practices that could help others succeed on the frontier. "Mrs. McKenna, I've been hearing remarkable stories about your barn." he said, his educated Eastern accent marking him as a newcomer to the territory. "I wanted to see it for myself and understand the techniques you employed. Would you mind giving me a tour and explaining your construction methodology?" Sarah showed him through the structure, explaining her construction methods in detail. The star drill holes and wooden wedge anchors, the stone masonry techniques she'd adapted from ancient practices, the challenges she'd overcome in framing the opening without conventional supports. She described how she'd learned to read the rock, to understand where sandstone would split cleanly and where it would crumble. She explained her reasoning for each design choice, from the positioning of the stalls to maximize space, to the drainage channel that kept the floor clean and dry. Morrison took extensive notes in a small, leather-bound journal, his pencil moving rapidly across the pages, and made several detailed sketches, measuring everything with a folding ruler he produced from his coat pocket. "This is extraordinary," he said finally. "You've essentially rediscovered principles of construction that have been largely forgotten. The efficiency of using natural landforms, the thermal advantages of earth-sheltered building, the structural integrity of properly executed rock masonry. Mrs. McKenna, would you object if I included this in my report to the territorial government? We're always looking for innovations that can help homesteaders succeed in this harsh environment." "Include whatever you like," Sarah said. "If it helps others, I'm happy to share." In March, as the snow finally began to melt, the neighbors started the work of rebuilding their barns. But this time, several of them incorporated elements of Sarah's design. James Hutchins built his barn against a hillside, backing it into the earth for insulation and protection. Robert Kemp used more stone and less timber, creating a hybrid structure that combined the best of both approaches. And they all came to Sarah for advice, treating her as an expert rather than an eccentric. One evening in April, after all the borrowed animals had been returned to their owners, Sarah and Jacob sat outside their cabin, watching the spring sunset paint the canyon walls in shades of red and gold. "Mama," Jacob said thoughtfully, "do you think Papa would be proud of what we built?" Sarah considered this carefully. "I think your father would be proud that we survived, that we found a solution when we had a problem, that we didn't give up when things were hard." She paused. "But I think he'd be most proud that we helped our neighbors when they needed us, even after they'd been unkind." Jacob nodded, absorbing this wisdom. "Will we build another one? Another rock barn somewhere else?" "Probably not," Sarah said. "One is enough for our needs. But if someone asks for help building theirs, we'll help them. That's what neighbors do." The canyon barn stood for decades, becoming a local landmark. Over the years, Sarah added improvements: a better door, glass windows instead of canvas, interior plasterwork to smooth the rough rock walls. But the basic structure remained as she'd built it in those 3 months of 1887. A testament to ingenuity, determination, and the wisdom of learning from those who came before. Other homesteaders throughout the territory did build rock barns, using variations of Sarah's techniques. Some were more elaborate, others simpler, but all of them worked. The design proved especially popular in canyon country, where the combination of available stone and natural alcoves made the approach practical. Years later, when Jacob was grown and the frontier had given way to settled towns and proper roads, he would bring his own children to see the barn his mother had built. By then, it housed a new generation of animals, but the structure itself was unchanged, solid, dependable, perfectly adapted to its environment. "Your grandmother built this with her own hands," he would tell his children. "Everyone said she was crazy. Everyone said it couldn't be done. But she knew better. She'd done her research, learned from those who built before her, and trusted herself to find a solution. The children would run their hands over the smooth stone walls, examine the massive beams anchored into the rock, peer up at the natural ceiling of sandstone that had sheltered animals and saved lives through countless brutal winters. And they would understand the lesson Sarah had taught without words, that sometimes the best solutions are the ones everyone says are impossible, that innovation often means looking backward to ancient wisdom rather than just forward to new technologies, that a determined person with limited resources but unlimited creativity can accomplish remarkable things. The neighbors who had mocked Sarah McKenna for building a barn into the canyon wall never forgot the winter it saved them all. They told their children, who told their children, until the story became part of local legend. The widow who built a fortress in stone, who sheltered friend and skeptic alike when the storms came. The barn itself stood long after Sarah passed away, long after Jacob grew old, long after most of the original homesteaders had died or moved on. It stood as a monument to the frontier spirit, to the ingenuity of those who carved homes and lives from the raw wilderness. And on cold winter nights, when storms swept through the canyon country and snow piled deep against the stone walls, the animals inside stayed warm and safe, protected by the vision and determination of a woman who refused to accept that something was impossible just because everyone said so. Sarah McKenna had built more than a barn. She'd built proof that sometimes the wisest path is the one no one else has thought to walk, that the strongest structures are those that work with nature rather than against it, and that the best answer to mockery is simply to keep building, one stone at a time, until the work speaks for itself.